New Mexico Territory, spring 1874. Thistle Bend was a town that lived on wind. It blew the red dust into everything, into the grit of a man's teeth, the folds of a woman's skirt, and the mechanisms of the new grist mill that screamed in protest day and night. The town was a chorus of harsh sounds, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the clatter of shod hooves on volcanic rock, and the new sound, the one that cut deepest, the shriek of a test locomotive feeling its way along brand new rails. This was a place of raw speculation, a town choking on its own dust and the bile of rumors. Iris Delaney stepped down from the stagecoach, a wraith in a dust-colored cloak, frayed at the shoulders and cuffs. She held her only possession tightly, a thin, flat wooden case, its edges worn smooth. It did not hold clothes. It held her mother's legacy brittle maps, survey charts, and yellowed legal papers. She was a teacher, but the only lessons she carried now were the hard ones of the road. She tried the hotel first, a 2-story false front with peeling paint that promised civilized lodgings. The clerk, a man with a thin mustache and watery eyes, took one look at her, a woman traveling alone, with no chaperone and no luggage save that strange flat box, and pronounced the hotel full. She tried the boarding house next, run by a woman who introduced herself as the head of the newly formed Thistle Bend Decency Committee. The woman's eyes raked over Iris, noting the weariness that she mistook for vagrancy, and the intelligent set of Iris's jaw that she mistook for defiance. "We have no room for transients," the woman had said, the word a dismissal that stung more than a slap. The committee, Iris learned in that brief, cold exchange, was determined to protect the town's moral fiber from the influx of railroad men and, it seemed, unescorted schoolteachers. The sun collapsed behind the western mesas, pulling all the heat from the world. The sky bled out in violent streaks of orange and purple before settling into a deep, cold indigo. The blacksmith's forge sighed its last, its column of smoke thinning to a gray wisp. The saloon doors swung open, spilling yellow light and the discordant notes of a poorly tuned piano onto the street, but that was a door she could not enter. She found herself in the back alley, drawn by the warm, animal smell of the livery stable. The owner, a barrel-chested man with a face like cured leather, was sliding a heavy bar across a side gate. "Sir," Iris said, her voice clear, though her body had begun to shiver. He turned, hand dropping to the gutta-percha handle of the pistol on his hip. "I need a place to sleep," she said quickly, holding her hands out. "Empty. Out of the wind. I was refused a room. I can pay something. A corner of the hay." The owner, O'Leary, squinted, his gaze sharp and assessing. He looked from her face to the thin case. "What's in the box?" "Papers. My mother's papers." "You ain't with the railroad?" "No, sir. And you ain't with that coven of hens calling themselves the Decency Committee." "They were the ones who turned me away," Iris said, a bitter edge to her voice. That seemed to satisfy him. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "This ain't a hotel, but it's colder than a banker's heart tonight." He jerked his head toward the wide barn door. "There's an empty stall, third on the left. Dry straw. You can have it, but I locked this door." He pointed to the main entrance. "And I want you gone before sunrise, before the town starts gossiping that I'm harboring runaways." "Thank you," she breathed, the relief so sharp it was almost painful. "Don't thank me. Just be gone by dawn." He tossed her a heavy wooden beam. "Bar that door from the inside, and don't open it." Iris slid the heavy beam into its iron brackets, the sound of it dropping into place, a hollow, final thud. The stable was vast and filled with shadows. It was warmer than the street, the air thick with the sweet smell of hay, the ammonia of the stalls, and the earthy scent of the horses themselves. They shifted and blew softly in the dark, their presence a strange comfort. She found the third stall. The straw was deep and dry. She sat, pulling her thin cloak tight, her back pressed against the rough-hewn planks. She placed the wooden case beside her, a poor substitute for a pillow. She was cold. She was exhausted, but she was, for the moment, safe. She tucked her hands into her sleeves and listened. The wind moaned around the eaves of the barn, and far off, that locomotive whistle cried again, a high metallic warning that sliced through the night. She must have drifted into a state of half-sleep, a tense crouch against the cold. A sound jolted her wide awake, a soft scrape, and then the quiet, heavy testing of the barred door. Iris was on her feet in a heartbeat, her body electric with fear. She fumbled in her pocket for the small, heavy iron file she carried for sharpening pencils. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. "Who's there?" she called, her voice betraying a tremor she hated. "The door is barred." There was a long silence. Then, a man's voice, low and rough as gravel. "O'Leary said I could fetch my saddle. He told me to bar the door and not open it." Iris countered, her knuckles white on the file. Another pause. A boot scraped on the hard-packed earth outside. "He was right to." The shadow of a man moved away from the door and appeared in the wide, unglazed window of the hayloft above. He was just a silhouette against the stars, but a tall one, broad-shouldered. He seemed to be looking down, trying to find her in the darkness of the stable. "I'm not trouble, ma'am," the voice said. "But I need my gear. I'm riding out." He disappeared from the window. She heard a click, and a small tack room door she hadn't seen a door inside the locked stable yard opened. The man stepped through. He was tall, as his shadow had promised, and moved with a quiet, predator's grace. The moonlight from the loft caught the angles of his face, a strong jaw and deep-set eyes shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. He did not look at her stall, but moved directly to the rack of saddles, his movements economical and sure. He smelled of the cold night air, of leather, and faintly of snow, a strange scent for a spring night, one that spoke of the high peaks he must have ridden down from. He lifted a heavy stock saddle from its peg. He was Colt Ashburn, though she did not know it, the solitary rancher from the high, lonely valley called Arroyo Azul, a place whispered to be either cursed or blessed, depending on the rumor. He slung the saddle onto his hip, his work done. He turned to leave through the tack room door, and then he stopped. He looked over, his gaze finally finding her. She was a small, shivering shape in the third stall, trying to make herself invisible. He watched her for a long, silent moment. She could feel the weight of his stare, but it was not like the leering gaze of the clerk or the judgmental one of the committee. It was just quiet, assessing. He said nothing. With one hand, he shifted the weight of the saddle. With the other, he reached to it, unlacing the leather ties that held his bedroll. He pulled free a heavy, dark wool blanket, an old army issue, thick and dense. He did not approach her. He did not speak. He took 2 steps toward the center aisle, and with a single, fluid motion of his wrist, he tossed the blanket. It flew through the air in a perfect, silent arc, unfolding slightly. It landed with a soft, heavy woof on the straw floor of her stall, just within her reach. "High desert night," he said, his voice clipping the words. "It drops fast. You'll freeze." Iris stared at the blanket. Her survival instincts, honed by months on the road, screamed at her to be wary of any kindness from a stranger. But her body, already aching with a deep, penetrating cold, yearned for the warmth it promised. Her fingers, numb and stiff, crept out from her cloak and touched the wool. It was thick, dry, and incredibly warm. Colt Ashburn watched her touch it. He gave a curt nod, as if a transaction was complete. He turned and stepped back into the tack room. "Bar that door behind me," he said, his voice muffled by the wood. She heard the latch lift on the yard side. "Wait," she whispered. He paused, his silhouette still framed in the doorway. "Why?" "Because," he said, after a moment, "I know what it is to be cold." The door clicked shut. He was gone, leaving behind only the scent of pine and distant snow, and the heavy blanket lying in the straw. Iris knelt and pulled the blanket toward her. She wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a profound comfort that sank deep into her bones. She pulled her thin wooden case to her chest, arranged the blanket, and lay down. curling into its heavy, protective folds. For the first time in weeks, the knot of fear and cold in her stomach began to unclench. That night, she did not dream of the train, or the cold-eyed women of the committee. She dreamt of a quiet valley and the scent of snow. That blanket, tossed by a lonely rancher, would become their flag, their shelter in sandstorms, their comfort by firelight. It would, one day, be the canopy under which they stood, beneath the shade of the cottonwoods, and made a promise. But for now, it was just warmth, and it was enough. Iris folded the heavy wool blanket before the sun had cleared the eastern mesas. She left it on the clean straw of the third stall, a silent payment for the warmth. She slipped the bar from the livery door and stepped out into the gray, pre-dawn chill. She was gone before O'Leary had even stirred to light his morning fire. A promise kept. The town of Thistle Bend was already coiling to life. Smoke rose from the chimney of the bakery, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer had begun. A cold, rhythmic striking of iron on iron. But the first thing that greeted her was a sound of a different kind, the sharp, wet slap of wheat paste against wood, and the self-righteous tones of a woman holding court. "There will be order," the woman announced. Her voice was as stiff as her whalebone corset. She was a large woman, not with fat, but with an unyielding, muscular presence, her hair pinned in a merciless bun. This was Laura Kincaid, the town mayor's wife, who, through sheer force of will and the creation of the Decency Committee, had become the town's unofficial mayor herself. She was directing two sheepish-looking men as they nailed a poster to the side of the land office. Iris drew closer, keeping to the shadows. The poster was printed in thick, black, accusatory letters. "Stop moral scandal. Protect Thistle Bend. The eyes of progress are upon us. Vagrants, idlers, and women of loose reputation will not be tolerated. This committee is empowered to preserve the character of our town." Laura Kincaid stepped back, admiring her work. "That," she said to her small, shivering audience, "should make the message clear to the rabble the railroad has seen fit to drag in." Her eyes scanned the street, passing over Iris without seeing her, dismissing her as just another shadow, another piece of undesirable rabble. As the sun rose, it illuminated another figure standing on the boardwalk, watching the poster hanging with a lazy, reptilian amusement. He was a tall man, gone to seed, a silver star pinned to a food-stained vest. This was Sheriff Jeb Motley. He was idly picking his teeth with a splinter of wood, his thumbs hooked in a gun belt that sagged under the weight of his gut. A man in a smart, Eastern-cut suit, a railroad man. His profession as obvious as a brand, strolled up to him, handing him a cheroot. "Mighty fine work your town is doing, Sheriff," the railroad man said, his voice smooth. "Clearing the way for civilization. We aim to please Mr. Dunn," Motley said, biting the end off the cheroot and spitting it into the dust. "The Rio Verdad Company wants a clean town for its land auction. It'll get a clean town. I'll sweep up all this trouble." He gestured vaguely at the sleeping forms of two drunk cowboys near the saloon. "Right before the bidding starts. You can count on that. The company values a cooperative spirit," Dunn said, lighting the sheriff's cigar. "A cooperative spirit is often rewarded." Motley took a deep, appreciative puff, the smoke momentarily obscuring his face. "Consider my spirit fully cooperative." Iris turned away, the sickness of the town settling in her stomach. She was cold, she was hungry, and she was an outcast. She needed work, she needed a foothold. She saw the sign, "Mrs. Gable's Seamstress Shop, fine mending custom gowns." A needle and thread. She could do that. She had mended her own cloak 100 times. She entered the shop, a small bell announcing her arrival. The air was warm and smelled of new calico and hot ironing. Mrs. Gable, a small, bird-like woman with spectacles perched on her nose, looked up. "Can I help you?" The tone was not unkind, but it was not welcoming. "I'm looking for work, ma'am," Iris said, forcing a strength into her voice she did not feel. "I can sew." "I'm very neat, and my stitches are small. I can mend, darn, or do piecework." "Mrs. Gable's eyes did a swift, professional inventory. She saw the frayed cloak, the worn boots, the one strange wooden case. "I have a girl, Mrs., Gable said, gesturing to a young woman in the back. I can read and write." Iris pressed, desperation making her bold. "I can keep your books. I can write your orders for you. I don't need a bookkeeper. I need a sewer." "Mrs.," Gable said, her gaze hardening. She was a member of the Decency Committee. She had been at the meeting where this lone woman was discussed. "Where are you from?" "I've been traveling," Iris evaded. "Alone?" "Yes. And your luggage?" "Mrs." Gable's eyes fixed on the flat wooden case. What's a teacher doing with a box like that? The word hung in the air. Teacher. The gossip had already spread from the hotel and the boarding house. "It's not a teacher's box," Iris said, her patience snapping. She unlatched the case. "It's a clerk's. See?" She opened it just a crack, revealing the neat, ordered contents. But what Mrs. Gable saw was not stationery. She saw the rolled, tied edges of cadastral maps. She saw the corner of a document with a notary's seal. She saw, just for a second, a letterhead from the Santa Fe land office. "Mrs." Gable recoiled, her face turning pale, then angry. "Get out!" "Ma'am, I know what those are. I know who you are." "Mrs." Gable's voice dropped to a harsh whisper, afraid the railroad man across the street might hear. "You're Eliza Delaney's girl." Iris froze, the name of her mother, spoken as a curse. "She was a good woman," Iris said, her voice shaking. "She was a fool, Mrs." Gable hissed. "She was a troublemaker who thought she knew better than the railroad, better than the government. She brought ruin on herself, and she nearly brought it on this town. We don't want that kind here. We don't want surveying inaccuracies." She spat the words. "We want the train. Now, get out of my shop." Iris backed out. The tinkling of the bell, a mocking, cheerful sound as the door closed. She stood on the boardwalk, the sun now high enough to be hot, but she had never felt colder. The rumors began to swirl around her, visible in the stares she now received. "That's her, the one who slept in the livery. O'Leary's place scandalous." "No. I heard it was the teacher with the box of papers. Heard she's a grifter, some kind of land swindler. She's Eliza Delaney's daughter. You know, the one who, well, you know." Iris clutched her case and walked, her head high, though she had nowhere to go. She was an infection, and the town was the body trying to expel her. She had reached the end of the street, where the town bled back into the desert, when a horse's shadow fell over her. She looked up. It was the man from the livery, the man with the blanket. He was mounted on a tall, raw-boned bay, and he led a pack mule loaded with canvas-wrapped supplies. He looked down at her, his face unreadable in the shadow of his hat. He had seen the entire exchange at the seamstress shop. He had heard the whispers. "Ma'am," he said. It was not a greeting, but a fact. Iris simply looked at him, too weary to be afraid, too proud to beg. He was Colt Ashburn. He did not speak in pleasantries. "I need a bookkeeper," he said, the words blunt. "The roundup starts in 2 weeks. My tally books are a mess." Iris stared. "A bookkeeper. And," he continued, as if he hadn't heard her, "my men, they're good with a rope, but they can't read a brand tally. Most of them can't sign their own name. I need someone to teach them. Letters, numbers, enough so they don't get cheated on a cattle buy." He was offering her a job. A tutoring job. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. The town saw her as a vagrant. This quiet, harsh-looking man saw her as an educator. "I pay $10 a month, plus room and board," he said, the offer stiff, as if he were bargaining for a horse. "The room is a separate cabin. It's clean. The board is beef and beans. It's hot." The whispers along the boardwalk had died. The town was watching. Laura Kincaid had emerged from the general store, her face a mask of thunderous disapproval. Sheriff Motley had turned, his hand resting on his pistol. "Mister," Motley called out, strolling toward them, "you might want to reconsider. This woman is under suspicion." She's a vagrant, by the Decency Committee's definition. Colt Ashburn did not look at the sheriff. His eyes remained on Iris. He was waiting for her answer, and his quiet patience was a shield against the entire town. She's Eliza Delaney's daughter. Mrs. Gable called from her doorway, as if this were the final, damning piece of evidence. Colt's gaze finally shifted. It moved past Iris, past the sheriff, and settled on the town itself. "I know who she is," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush. "I'm hiring her for who she is, a woman who can read. Can any of you say the same?" It was a slap in the face. He turned back to Iris. "Well?" She looked at the town, at the posters, the sneering sheriff, the judgmental women. There was nothing for her here but wind and hate. Then she looked at Colt Ashburn. She saw the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his hands on the reins, and she looked into his eyes. They were gray as a winter sky, and they held a silence that did not accuse, did not judge, did not harm. It was the same silence of the man who had given her a blanket because he knew what it was to be cold. "Yes," Iris said, her voice clear and strong. "I will take the job. Put your case on the mule," he said. He didn't offer her a hand up. He simply waited. She tied her thin case securely to the pack saddle, gathered her skirts, and with a strength born of pure defiance, mounted the mule. Sitting astride like a man, she didn't care. Colt turned his horse's head, and they rode out of Thistle Bend, the silent, gaping stares of the Decency Committee burning on her back. They rode for 2 hours, saying nothing. The town dropped away, and the landscape opened up into a vast, beautiful, and brutal expanse of red rock and juniper. The air grew cleaner, thinner. They were following a dry riverbed, a deep arroyo. When Iris saw it, it was a stake of new, raw wood, driven deep into the baked earth, a surveyor's marker. Iris felt a jolt, as if she'd been struck. "Stop," she said. Colt reined in his horse, watching her. She slid down from the mule and approached the marker. The carvings were fresh. She saw the section number, the township. They were the same numbers she had memorized from her mother's maps. "My case," she said, her voice tight. He untied it and handed it to her. She laid it flat on a rock, unlatched it, and pulled out a rolled map, her mother's hand. The ink was faded, the lines drawn with a beautiful, precise hand. She knelt in the dust, the map spread before her, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked from the map to the marker, to the sun, to the high peaks that served as a reference. "This is wrong," she whispered. She stood and walked back to the marker, the map in her hand. "This is all wrong." "What is?" Colt asked, his voice low. "This marker, the survey." She pointed. "According to my mother's survey, the one she filed with the Santa Fe office 8 years ago, the line for this section is a half-mile east, over that ridge. And this one? This one?" Iris looked up, her eyes wide with a terrible, dawning comprehension. She pointed to the high green valley they had just begun to enter, the Arroyo Azul. "This one gives the entire head of the valley, the springs, all of it, to the railroad plot. Section 14, the one up for auction." She looked at Colt, her face pale. "This marker, it steals your water. It steals the lifeblood of this entire valley." She expected him to be angry, to curse. He did neither. He sat on his horse, looking at the fresh-cut stake, his face as still and hard as the red rock around them. He had known, instinctively, that something was wrong. His cattle had been pushed back, his fences questioned. But here, in her hands, was the proof, the reason. He finally looked down at her, a single, grim nod. "We'll measure it again." The arroyo they followed was a scar of dry, red rock, but it acted as a gate. As they rode through the narrowest point, the high canyon walls on either side suddenly fell away, and the world opened up. It was not a grand, empty vista, but a contained, secret valley. The wind changed. In Thistle Bend, it had been a high-pitched, sand-blasting shriek. Here, it was a low-throated whisper, a sound that moved through things rather than scouring them. It was the sound of tens of thousands of leaves moving in unison. Arroyo Azul was named for the thin, impossible ribbon of water that ran through its center, gleaming a deep turquoise against the red earth. Following that water was a thick, defiant line of cottonwood trees. It was spring, and they were in full, glorious release, shedding their seeds in great white, fluffy clouds that drifted on the air like a gentle summer snow. The air smelled sharp and clean, of damp earth and wild sagebrush. The ranch itself was not a house. It was a compound, built for practicality, not beauty. Yet it held a kind of rugged grace, an adobe main house with a deep, shaded porch, a long, low bunkhouse for the men, a spider's web of corrals, and a blacksmith shop that looked smaller, quieter than the one in town. As they rode into the main yard, the sound of their arrival was met by another, the steady, musical clanking of a dozen small bells. A herd of cattle, grazing on the far slope, turned their heads as one, their bells ringing. Before returning to their breakfast, a man was sitting on the porch of the main house, mending a braided leather riata. He did not look up immediately. He finished the intricate pass of the leather thong, pulled it tight with a practiced, gloved hand, and only then did he set it down. He was older, perhaps 60, perhaps 80. His face was a roadmap of the Sonoran Desert, sun-baked to the color of old mahogany, and cross-hatched with 1,000 deep lines. He was Severo Molina. He had been a vaquero when California was still Mexico, and he had taught Colt Ashburn everything he knew about horses, cattle, and the unforgiving language of the land. He rose, not with the creakiness of an old man, but with the fluid, balanced motion of someone who had spent his entire life on his feet. "Colt," he said, his voice like dry leaves. "Severo." Colt swung down from his horse. "This is Miss Iris Delaney. She'll be keeping the books and teaching the boys their letters." Severo Molina's eyes, black and bright as obsidian chips, moved to Iris. He looked at her. He did not look at her as a woman. He looked at her as one might examine a strange piece of weather. His gaze drifted to the thin wooden case she clutched, then back to her face. He had seen land disputes before. He had seen them settled with ink, and he had seen them settled with lead. He knew that a box of papers, in this territory, was often more dangerous than a box of dynamite. He gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Not welcome." "The coffee is hot. The beans are ready." He turned and disappeared back into the darkness of the house. "Your cabin is this way," Colt said, gesturing to a small, separate adobe building set under the shade of its own massive cottonwood. It was the old foreman's. It's clean. It held a narrow cot, a small table, a 3-legged stool, and a cold, pot-bellied stove. It was, Iris thought, the most beautiful room she had ever seen. That evening, she was called to the main house for dinner. The bunkhouse crew, 3 young, rough-hewn cowboys, and the older Severo were already at the long plank table. They shuffled their feet and fell silent when she entered, pulling off their hats and looking at their plates with intense concentration. The meal was simple and profoundly satisfying. A thick, smoky stew of pinto beans and salt pork, a skillet of hot cornbread, crusty and yellow, and a pot of coffee so black and strong it could have walked on its own. Iris went to sit at the end of the bench, just as she was about to settle onto the hard wood. Colt moved from his place at the head of the table. He was holding the heavy wool blanket from the livery. He folded it neatly, twice, and placed it on the bench seat. A simple gesture, done without comment, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, like pulling out a chair. But to Iris, it was everything. It was the livery stable. It was the ride out of town. It was a silent, binding contract. She sat on the warmth of the wool, a sudden, sharp tightness in her throat. She looked down at her plate. Severo Molina watched this. He noted the blanket, and he noted the way the boss did not meet the woman's eyes, and he filed it away. The next days settled into a rhythm, slow and sure as the turning of the earth. Iris found the ranch ledgers. They were a disaster, loose tallies on scraps of feed sacks, receipts impaled on a nail by the door, and a few cryptic notes on the back of a label for horse liniment. She claimed the small office, scrubbed the desk clean, and bought a bottle of brown ink from the ranch supplies. She set to work, her mind finally, blessedly, engaged. She untangled the numbers, her neat, precise script bringing order to the chaos. The smell of ink and old paper was a balm. At midday, when the sun was too high to work cattle, she held her class. The 3 cowboys, Billy, Finn, and a young man named Pace sat on the porch steps, their faces grim with the humiliation of it. They held roofing slates, their big calloused hands clumsy with the small sticks of chalk. A, Iris said, drawing the letter. For Arroyo. B, she continued. For Brand. For Billy. Billy, a boy of no more than 18 with a shock of red hair, blushed to the roots of his scalp, but dutifully copied the letter. When she wasn't teaching or wrestling with the books, she was mapping. With her mother's maps as a guide, she began drawing a new one, a map of the ranch itself, in brown ink. She walked the fence lines, noting the state of the posts. She marked the locations of the water troughs. She traced the path of the arroyo, the pen in her hand feeling like a continuation of her thoughts. Colt Ashburn was rarely seen, and even more rarely heard. He left before dawn and returned after dusk, smelling of horse, sweat, and the vast, empty rangeland. He was a silent presence, but Iris began to realize that his silence was a form of action. The first evening, she had stood on her stool, straining to reach the heavy lantern that hung from a high beam in the breezeway between the kitchen and the main house. Her fingers had barely brushed the hot glass. The next morning, she came out to find the lantern was gone. She found it, hours later, rehung from a new, lower bracket, hammered securely into the porch post, well within her reach. He had also cleaned the globe and filled the reservoir. A few days later, the wooden latch on her cabin door began to stick. The dry air had warped the frame, and she had to throw her shoulder against it to open it. It woke her twice in the night, the scraping sound loud in the quiet. When she returned from her midday lesson, she saw a small, neat pile of pale wood shavings on her doorstep. She put her hand on the latch. It moved smoothly, and the door swung open without a sound, closing behind her with a soft, satisfying click. He never mentioned these things. He never waited for thanks. He simply saw a thing that was broken, or difficult, and he fixed it. He moved through her life as he moved through his ranch, shoring up fences, easing gates, ensuring things worked. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Iris slept. She did not bolt her door. She did not lie awake, listening for the sounds of a hostile town. She lay in her small cot, the wind outside stirring the cottonwood leaves, and she could hear the distant, lonely call of a coyote. It was not the warning shriek of the train whistle. It was a wild, clean sound that affirmed the valley's emptiness, its safety. She had placed her mother's wooden case on the floor beside her cot. It was not a pillow, but a nightstand. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first she had known since her mother died, late, long after the moon had risen to bleach the valley silver. Colt sat on the porch. Severo emerged from the shadows and sat on the top step, a small clay bottle in his hand. He poured a finger of smoky mezcal into 2 small cups. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the zizit of insects and the faint, distant ringing of the cattle bells. "The teacher," Severo said, not asking a question. Colt said nothing, just sipped the mezcal. "She looks at the land," Severo observed, staring out into the darkness. "The railroad men, they look at the land and see only a straight line to lay iron. The miners, they look and see what is under it. The women in town, they look and see only what they are told." He took a drink, the liquor hot. She looks at it like it is her kin," he said, searching for the word. "Like she is reading a letter from someone she lost." Colt looked down at the cup in his hand. He swirled the potent liquid, watching the moonlight catch it. He thought of the new, neat ink on his ledgers. He thought of the sound of her voice, patient and clear, as she taught his men the alphabet. And he thought of her, kneeling in the dust of the arroyo, her face pale as she stared at the false marker. The land needs someone who can listen, Colt said, his voice low. Severo nodded. It was all the confirmation he needed, a thread of trust. Fine as a cactus spine, but with all its capacity to hold fast, had begun to stitch itself between the school teacher and the silent rancher. In the valley of the Blue Arroyo, under the snow of the cottonwoods, something was taking root. The quiet order Iris brought to the ranch ledgers was a surface calm. In her cabin, at night, she waged a different kind of war. By the light of a single, clean-globed lantern, she laid out the contents of her mother's case, transforming her small table into a command center. The maps were the key. She unrolled them, weighing the corners with smooth river stones. They were not just drawings. They were legal declarations. Her mother, Eliza Delaney, had been a clerk in the Santa Fe Land Office, one of the few women in the territory with a mastery of cadastral surveying. Her handwriting, in the margins and on the legends, was immaculate. Iris pored over them, her knowledge of legal land descriptions, learned at her mother's knee, coming back sharp and clear. There it was. Township 15 South, Range 10 West. She traced the lines her mother had drawn, lines that had been established by the original government surveys of 1858. The boundary line was clear, running a half-mile east of the Arroyo Azul. The map explicitly noted the Azul Springhead and its associated riparian lands as belonging to the ranching parcels, not the federal sections designated for railroad expansion. The maps were not the only thing. Tucked beneath a false bottom in the case, wrapped in oilcloth, was her mother's final journal, and a letter, folded and refolded so many times the creases were like thread. It was not addressed. It was a testament. Iris read it, her heart a cold stone. Eliza wrote of pressure, of gentlemen from the Rio Verdad Company, visiting her office after hours. They had offered her money, a full $1,000, to correct a minor discrepancy in the filings. When she refused, they had pointed out how tragic it would be for a lone woman to find herself without a position, or worse. They are moving the markers, Eliza had written, her script, usually so perfect, becoming slightly erratic. They are pulling the line west to swallow the valley. They are using a false magnetic declination to justify it, a full 2 degrees of error. It is theft, sanctioned by men in suits. I have filed my report with the Surveyor General. I have sent a copy to the district court. I pray it is enough. It was the last entry. 2 days later, a fire had broken out in the Santa Fe Land Office. It was ruled a tragic accident. A lamp, they said, overturned late at night. Eliza Delaney, working late as always, was the only victim. Iris had never believed it. Now, holding this letter in the quiet of the high desert valley, she knew it was a lie. Her mother had not died in an accident. She had been murdered. Murdered for these lines on a piece of paper, for the water that flowed less than 100 yards from where Iris now sat. That night, she found Colt and Severo on the porch, finishing their nightly coffee. She was pale, her hands gripping the oilcloth packet. "I need to tell you," she said, her voice low and tight. They listened. As she spoke, the story of her mother poured out not as a tale of grief, but as a deposition. The maps, the refusal, the threats. Finally, the lamp accident. When she finished, the silence of the porch was heavy, absolute. Severo was the one to break it. He looked not at Iris, but at Colt. "The brother," he said. Colt's face, unreadable in the dark, tightened. "What brother?" Iris asked. Colt said nothing. He stared out at the valley, at the cottonwoods moving like ghosts in the moonlight. "Colt had an older brother," Severo said, his voice flat. A recitation of a painful history. "Ethan, this was, 10, maybe 11 years ago, right after the war. Ethan was the one who held the deed. He was a good man, but not a hard one. He didn't understand this land. He didn't listen to it." He paused, refilling a cup with coffee he didn't drink. "A man came through, a speculator, started a rumor. The same one that's always in the air here, that the spring, the Azul, was drying up. That it was a seasonal seep, not a true artesian source." He nodded toward the town, 30 miles away. That rumor was started in the saloon in Thistle Bend by a man who had just pinned a star to his vest, Jeb Motley. Iris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Motley told everyone the railroad surveys had proved the valley would be dry in 5 years. Severo continued. Ethan, he panicked. He saw his herd dying. He saw his future turning to dust. The railroad, the same Mr. Dunn you saw, made him an offer, 10 cents on the dollar for his land. He said it was a courtesy. Ethan took it. He signed the papers, packed his bags, and went back east. He died of consumption in St. Louis 2 years later. But Colt, Iris whispered. Colt did not own the land, Severo said. He just worked it. When Ethan left, Colt stayed. He was a squatter. He had no paper. But he had the riata. He had his horses. And he knew the rumor was a lie. He stayed, and he held this valley by sheer will. When the railroad saw he wouldn't be moved, and their surveys couldn't make him leave, they let him be. They had what they wanted, Ethan's section, the one to the east, or so they thought. Colt finally spoke, his voice like rocks grinding together. They didn't buy Ethan's land. They bought the land the marker said was his, the false line. Iris understood. They cheated him. They created a lie to devalue the land, but the land they bought was already worthless. The land they wanted, the land with the water, was yours. Or rather, she corrected. It was still legally his, which means it's yours. Paper, Colt said. The word a curse. It means nothing. They have the guns. They have the judge. Motley is their man. The auction is in 3 days. They will auction my land, the land they are now claiming through their new, fraudulent survey, the one based on the marker we saw. They will buy it. And this time, they will have a federal deed, and they will come with armed men to enforce it. Then we will prove the survey is fraudulent, Iris said, her voice ringing with a sudden, hard conviction. This was no longer just his fight. It was her mother's. We will do what my mother tried to do. We will resurvey the line ourselves. Colt looked at her, a long, assessing stare. He had seen her strength, but this was something new. It was the righteous, cold anger of an avenger. We'll measure it again. He repeated his words from the arroyo, but this time they were not a suggestion. They were a vow. The next day, they did not ride out with ropes and branding irons. They rode out with the tools of her mother's trade, tools Colt had kept in his forge, oiled and ready, though he had never spoken of them. A Brunton compass, its brass casing gleaming, its needle precise, a Gunter's chain, 66 feet of iron links, the instrument that had measured a continent, and that night they would use the sky itself, Polaris, the North Star, the one fixed point in a turning world, to establish a true, unassailable baseline. Severo, Colt, and Iris. They rode back to the first false marker. My mother wrote that they were using a false declination, Iris said, kneeling, the Brunton compass in her hand. A 2-degree error. Let's see. She set the compass on a flat rock, adjusted the sights, and took a reading from the peaks her mother had used as a reference. She did the math, her pencil scratching on a piece of paper. She looked up, her face grim. It's not 2 degrees, she said. It's 3. They've gotten bolder. For 2 days, they worked. They chained the land, link by link. Severo held one end, his ancient, gnarled hands unmoving. Colt drove the marking pins, his hammer blows economical and precise. Iris took the readings, checked the angles, and made the notes. Her mother's journal opened beside her. They found the second marker, driven deep in a dry wash, and the third, hidden in a stand of juniper, all new, all raw wood, and all of them, when measured against her mother's original, legally filed survey, were off. They were off by the same precise, intentional, and fraudulent distance. All of them worked in unison to pull the boundary line west, to steal the Arroyo Azul, to put the springhead squarely in the center of the parcel to be auctioned. This is it, Iris said, her hands stained with dust and graphite. This is the proof. We have the original, filed survey. We have our new measurements. We take this to the district judge. We file an injunction." Colt wiped the sweat from his face with a dusty forearm. He looked at her, his admiration warring with his grim practicality. "And the judge," he said, his voice flat. "Who do you think he is?" "He's a United States official," Iris argued. "He's bound by oath. He's bound by the Rio Verdad payroll." Colt countered. "He's Laura Kincaid's cousin. We file this. He'll bury it in paperwork. He'll lose the file. He'll question the credentials of a woman surveyor. He will delay and delay until after the auction. And once that hammer falls and the deed is signed, it's over." "Then what?" Iris cried, the frustration breaking her voice. "We just let them take it." "No," Colt said. "We don't go to the court. We go to the people. But this," he tapped her ledger of notes, "it's not enough. It's your word against theirs. A dead woman's map against a new, official survey. We need more." "More?" Iris looked around the empty, sun-blasted landscape. "There is nothing else." "Yes, there is," came a new voice, a reedy, terrified sound from the rocks above them. "There's me." Colt had his pistol out before the man even finished speaking. Severo had moved like a shadow, his hand on the hilt of the long knife at his belt. A man stumbled out from behind a large granite boulder, his hands held high and shaking. He was thin, with a watery, frightened face, his clothes in tatters. He looked like he had been living in the rocks for weeks. "Don't shoot," he yelped. "Please, I've been watching you. I knew you were on the square." "Who are you?" Colt's voice was sharp. "Wick, Josiah Wick," the man stammered. I was part of the survey crew, the new one, the one that moved the markers." Iris and Colt exchanged a look. "I didn't want to," Wick said, tears of pure terror and relief streaming down his face, cutting paths through the grime. "They made me. The foreman. He was on the railroad's payroll. He'd get the readings from me, and he'd just write down a different number he said it was to correct for local attraction. But I knew I'm an honest surveyor." "Then why did you sign?" Iris asked, her voice cold. "He said they'd see me dead," Wick whispered. "Said I'd end up like that woman in Santa Fe, the one who had the lamp accident. He said they were watching me." Iris's blood ran cold. "So I ran," Wick continued, his body shaking. "I took my pay, and I ran up here. I've been living on jackrabbits in fear, hiding by the spring. I knew they'd kill me if I went to town. But then I saw you, measuring, with the chain, the right way." Colt holstered his pistol, his face a mask of calculation. "What do you have?" "This." Wick fumbled inside his torn shirt and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped book. "I kept my own notes, the real ones, the real bearings, the real distances. And I took the field map, the original one the foreman was supposed to burn." He handed it to Iris. It was a new map, but on it, 2 lines were drawn, one in black marked official, the second, in faint red pencil, marked actual. The red line matched her mother's survey perfectly. This was it, the smoking gun. "You're right," Colt said to Iris, a new, hard energy in his voice. "We don't go to the judge." He turned to Wick. "The land auction. It's in 2 days, at noon, on the town square." Wick recoiled. "No, they'll kill me. Motley will be busy," Colt said. "He'll be watching the stand." A plan began to form, sharp and dangerous. "They are holding a public auction," Iris said, the pieces clicking into place. "A public display of their legal claim. We will make it public. More public than they ever intended." Colt nodded. "Severo, you'll get him to the ranch. Keep him out of sight. Feed him. Put some iron in his spine." Severo nodded, clapping a hand on Wick's shoulder that was half comfort, half capture. Colt turned to Iris. "You wanted to go to court. You'll get your day." He looked at the map, then at the stolen valley, then at her. "We're going to hold our own trial, right in the middle of their auction. We'll make that snake Wick swear on a Bible in front of the entire town, and he will read that map aloud. The day before the auction, the world held its breath. The sky over Thistle Bend and the Arroyo Azul was not blue, but a bruised, yellowish gray. The air was dead, still and heavy, carrying a pressure that made the cattle restless and the men short-tempered. Severo stood on the porch, sniffed the air, and went to check the latches on the horse stalls. A storm, he said to no one, but not a wet one. It hit in the late afternoon. It was not a storm of rain, but of earth. A rolling, 1,000-foot-high wall of red dust and sand moved in from the east, an unstoppable, churning tide. It swallowed the sun in an instant. The world went from a pale, sick yellow to a deep, suffocating, rumbling darkness. The wind did not howl, it screamed, a high-pitched, abrasive shriek that sounded like the earth itself was being torn apart. Inside the main house, Iris and Colt were huddled over the maps one last time, with Josiah Wick, the terrified surveyor, muttering in the corner. The first gust hit the house like a physical blow, rattling the windows in their frames. "Billy Finn, get the livestock into the close corrals, secure the barn." Colt's voice was barely audible over the din, but the wind was a cover, a tool. It was Iris who smelled it first, not the clean, earthy smell of dust, but something else, something acrid, sharp, and hungry. "Smoke," she whispered, her head lifting. Before Colt could react, Billy's voice, ripped to shreds by the wind, came from the yard. "Fire, God Almighty! Fire!" Colt kicked the door open and the wind nearly tore it from his hand. He stepped out onto the porch and froze. The hay barn, the largest structure, the one filled with a season's worth of dry feed, had exploded. The wind, striking a spark, had turned it into a furnace. A great, roaring serpent of red-gold flame coiled into the black, dusty sky, so bright it painted the entire ranch in a flickering, hellish light. It was not just burning, it was consuming. "It is them!" Wick shrieked from the doorway. "It is Motley! They are burning us out!" The fire, driven by the gale, was already licking at the roof of the main stables, where the prized horses, including Colt's big gray mare, Pluma, were trapped. Chaos erupted. The hands ran for buckets, but the wind snatched the water from them, turning it to steam and spray before it ever reached the flames. "Severo, get the horses!" Colt roared. "Billy, Finn, to the well! Keep the roof of the house wet. Don't let it catch." Iris watched him, expecting him to grab a bucket, to join the futile effort. He did not. He turned and ran, not toward the fire, but toward his saddle, still slung over the porch rail. He grabbed his riata. "Colt, what are you doing?" she screamed over the wind. He didn't answer. He was already in the yard, his boots sinking into the dust, his eyes on the fire. He was calculating. The wind was pushing the flames west, from the hay barn directly to the stables. He had to sever the connection. He began to spin the rope, a slow, building circle, the rawhide heavy and purposeful. The loop grew, wider and wider, humming in the wind. With a surge of his shoulders, he let it fly. The loop sailed up, up, into the heart of the smoke and flame. An impossible, perfect throw. It settled, unseen, over the main crossbeam of the burning roof section that connected to the stable. He did not pull. He wrapped the other end of the rope around the thick, immovable hitching post in the center of the yard, pulling the slack with the precision of a watchmaker. He tied it off, the knot biting deep. "Now," he grunted, "we wait for the wind." While he had been fighting the structure, Iris had seen the life. In a small pen adjoining the burning barn, a dozen new calves were huddled, bawling in terror, their small bodies pressed against the wooden fence that was already beginning to smoke. She didn't think. She ran, not to the house, but to her own cabin. She burst inside, grabbed the first thing she could find that was thick enough to offer protection. It was the dark wool blanket, the one from the livery. She ran to the water trough, plunged the blanket in, the wool soaking up the water, becoming impossibly heavy. She hauled it out, her arms straining, and ran to the calf pen. "Open the gate!" she screamed at Finn, who was running past. He kicked the latch, and the calves, blinded by panic, only pressed harder against the back fence. The air was a storm of fist-sized, burning embers. Iris threw the heavy, soaked blanket over her own head and shoulders and plunged into the pen. The heat was a physical blow. She grabbed the first calf, a small, trembling thing. She wrapped the blanket around its head, covering its eyes and nose, shielding it from the suffocating smoke. Blinded, but guided by her push, it stumbled out of the gate. She went back, again and again. Her hair began to singe. The thick wool of the blanket was steaming, but it did not burn, its dense fibers a shield. Severo, his face a mask of soot, was fighting his own battle. He had gotten into the main stable. The horses were screaming, rearing, their eyes white. He got the first two out, slapping their rumps and sending them galloping into the dark. He was trying to get to Pluma, the mare, who was trapped in the back stall. He kicked the stall door open and was met by a wall of heat. He saw a man, crouched by the wall. Not a ranch hand. The man lunged at him, a knife flashing. Severo, old but not slow, met him, not with a fist, but with an iron boot to the knee. The man crumpled. Severo saw the glint of a deputy's star on his vest. As the man fell, his belt was visible, the buckle a large, gaudy silver M. Severo grabbed the man's pistol from its holster, ripped the buckle from the belt, and left him. He grabbed Pluma's halter. "Come, ha!" he hissed, and dragged the terrified mare out into the storm. The wind reached a crescendo, with a sound like a freight train. It struck the ranch, the 3 lanterns hanging from the porch, the only stable source of light in the yard, exploded, their glass vaporized, their flames extinguished in an instant. The world went from a flickering, chaotic red to an absolute, terrifying black. Iris had just pushed the last calf from the pen. She threw the smoldering blanket off her head and turned, gasping for air. But there was no air, only smoke, and she was blind. The fire was a pulsing, dull red glow to her left. The house, she thought it was to her right, but she was disoriented. The roar of the wind and fire was in her ears, a deafening, all-consuming sound. "Colt!" she screamed. Her voice was a dry croak. "Severo!" She was alone. She took a step, and her boots sank into a bed of hot ash. The leather hissed, and she cried out, stumbling back into a fence post. She was trapped between the cinders and the fire, and she could not see the way out. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the heat. A hand closed on her shoulder. It was not a grasp, it was a vice. She was spun around, so fast she nearly fell. A dark shape, blacker than the smoke, was in front of her. Colt. He did not speak. He did not have to. He grabbed her right wrist. In his other hand, he held a long, thin strip of leather, a rein he must have cut from a nearby saddle. In one swift, practiced motion, he looped it around her wrist, pulled it tight, and tied the other end to his own. A prisoner's knot. He tugged, hard. "Walk," he commanded, his voice a low growl in her ear. He was her anchor. He did not run. He walked, deliberately, pulling her behind him. Every time she stumbled, the leather rein bit into her skin, and his steady, unyielding pull righted her. He led her out of the smoke cloud, through the blinding, stinging sand, and onto the solid wood of the porch. Just as her boots hit the planks, the world changed again. Something cold and wet struck her face, and then again, a low sizzle began to build. A sound to rival the fire. The high-pitched shriek of the wind was joined by a deep, drumming roar. The storm, having delivered its payload of fire and sand, had broken. A cloudburst, rain, a rare and violent high desert deluge, fell from the sky. It did not come in drops. It came in solid, icy sheets. The sound of it hitting the blazing timbers was a deafening explosion of steam. The fire hissed. It fought. And then, in a great, wet, sputtering sigh, it died. They were left in a yard of mud and steaming ash, soaked to the bone, panting. The hay barn was gone, but the house stood. The stables, though scorched, were standing. The prize horses were scattered in the darkness, but they were alive. Severo appeared, leading the big gray mare. Pluma was choking, A horrible, wet, rasping sound came from her chest as she heaved, her sides shuddering. "The smoke," Severo said, his voice grim, fighting to hold her head. "Her lungs are full of it." Iris, untying her wrist from the rein with fumbling, numb fingers, went to the horse. "Easy," she said, her voice still a whisper. She put her hands on the mare's trembling, wet face. "Easy, Pluma, easy, girl." The mare's eyes were wide, rolling in panic. Iris did not back away. She pressed her own forehead against the horse's broad, damp brow. "Breathe with me," she murmured, her voice a low, steady sound beneath the dying storm. "Breathe with me, slow, slow." She inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, her own breath warming the mare's face. The horse shuddered, coughed, and then, as if by magic, seemed to latch onto the rhythm. The panicked heaving subsided. The rasping in her chest eased. Pluma let out a long, shaky breath and leaned her heavy head into Iris's shoulder. Colt had watched it all. He walked to the ruins of the fence line, where Severo had dropped the stolen buckle. He bent, picking the piece of silver, the stylized M, from the mud. It was still warm. He closed his fist around it, the metal cutting into his palm. He walked to where Iris stood, her hand still stroking the mare's neck. His face was a mask of soot and cold, righteous fury. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a new, lethal edge. "We are not just going to the auction. We're going to take that false marker, and we are going to drive it straight through the center of their platform." Iris looked up at him. She saw the M in his fist. And then she saw his other hand, the hand that had held the riata, the hand that had fought the fire. The palm was raw, a deep, angry red, the skin already blistering from the heat of the rope. She reached out, her fingers, stained with ink and soot, touching his wrist. She turned his hand over, ignoring his flinch. He would face a fire, but he was terrified of this. She saw the deep, angry burn. Without a word, she bent her head and, as gently as the cottonwood fluff, she blew on the raw skin. Colt stopped breathing, the sensation of her breath, cool and soft. On his scorched hand was a shock more profound than the fire. She looked up, her face inches from his, her eyes, clear and steady, meeting his. Her hand was still there, cupping his larger, rougher one. It was the first time they had touched, not in panic, not by necessity, but by choice, and she let her hand rest there, her thumb stroking the back of his, for a single, long heartbeat, a silent promise in the wreckage. The fire died in a hiss of steam, and the deluge began. The rain that fell was not a gentle spring shower. It was a sudden, violent unburdening of the sky. It fell in sheets, cold and heavy, turning the yard of ash into a sea of black mud. Severo and the boys, their faces masked with soot, were already moving, their voices low as they tried to round up the spooked horses and secure the scorched, but standing, stable doors. The immediate danger was past, leaving only the bone-deep chill and the adrenaline-laced exhaustion. Colt stood in the center of the yard, the silver M buckle still in his fist. Iris was beside him, her hand still resting on Pluma's neck, the mare now breathing steadily. They were both soaked to the skin in seconds, the icy rain plastering their clothes to their bodies, washing the soot from their faces in clean, pale tracks. Colt looked at Iris. Her teeth had begun to chatter, a violent, uncontrollable shivering that shook her whole frame. It was not just the cold. It was the shock, the reaction to the terror that had finally broken. He said nothing. He turned, his burned hand held stiffly at his side, and gestured with his head toward the one building that had remained untouched, the small, thick-walled adobe tack room. He led the way. Iris followed, her boots making sucking sounds in the mud. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, and a wave of warmth and familiar smells enveloped them. The room was small, lit by a single lantern they had left burning on the workbench. It was a space of profound, masculine order. The walls were lined with saddles on wooden trees, bridles hanging in neat, gleaming rows, their bits shining like silver. The air was thick with the rich scent of oiled leather, saddle soap, and the sharp, clean smell of dried mint bunches that Severo hung from the rafters. And the sound. The roar of the fire was replaced by the deafening drumbeat of the rain on the tin roof. It was a constant, isolating roar that shut the rest of the world out. Iris moved to the center of the room, water dripping from her hair and the hem of her dress, forming a puddle on the dry floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body still shaking. Colt watched her. He saw the way she held herself, as if trying to keep from flying apart. He looked past her, his gaze landing on his own saddle, which he had brought in earlier to repair a broken concho. Draped over it, folded and dry, was the heavy, dark wool blanket. He did not hesitate. He walked to the saddle, his boots loud on the wooden planks. He picked up the blanket, its familiar weight a comfort in his one good hand. He turned. This time, he did not toss it. The room was too small, the moment too large. He walked the 3 steps to her, until he was standing directly in front of her. So close she had to tilt her head back to look at him. She saw him, truly, for the first time. The hard, remote rancher was gone. The man who stood before her was smeared with soot, his hair matted with sweat and rain, his eyes a deep, stormy gray, filled with the fire he had just fought. Slowly, deliberately, he unfolded the blanket. He lifted it and draped it over her shoulders, pulling the ends forward, his hands brushing her arms, her neck, settling the weight on her. The warmth was immediate, but it was his closeness that made her stop breathing. His hands did not leave. They rested on the blanket at her collarbones, his thumbs brushing the skin of her neck, just below her jaw. The lantern light was warm and yellow. It caught the silver in his hair, and it illuminated her. He saw the pale track on her cheek where the rain had washed a path through the soot, and he saw the long, graceful smear of black ash that curved from her jawline down the side of her neck, a defiant mark left by the fire. His gaze fixed on it, his hand, the unburned one, lifted as if of its own accord. He had an urge, stronger than any he had ever known, to wipe that last trace of violation away, to touch the skin beneath. He stopped. His fingers, calloused and rough, hovered an inch from her throat. He saw her eyes widen, her breath catch. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, rough rasp, barely audible over the rain. "Is this all right?" It was not a question about the soot. It was a question about everything, about the blanket, about the room, about the look in his eyes, about the way his hands were still resting on her shoulders. Iris looked at him. She had been braced for so long, against so many things, against the town, the whispers, the fire. She had no more strength to brace against this. She did not want to. She gave a single, slow, definitive nod. A small puff of air escaped her lips. Yes, his hand, the unburned one, moved. His thumb, rough as sandpaper, touched her face, then moved to the line of soot on her neck. He did not wipe it away. He traced it, his touch impossibly, reverently gentle, from her jaw, down the long, smooth column of her throat, to the hollow where her collarbone began. A shock, pure and electric, went through her. Her eyes closed for just a second. Her own hands, which had been clenched at her sides, came up. She laid one, palm flat, against his chest. She felt the solid, unyielding muscle beneath the damp wool of his shirt, and under it, she felt it, the steady, powerful, reliable beat of his heart. It felt like the ground after the rain. It felt like bedrock. He did not move his hand from her neck. Her hand did not move from his chest. They stood like that, in the small, warm, leather-scented room, surrounded by the roar of the storm, just breathing, the cold air, the smoke, and the rain, in and out. He leaned in, his head dropping, until his forehead came to rest against hers. It was a gesture of profound exhaustion, of shared burdens, and of a surrender so complete it made her heart ache. His breath, warm and tasting of smoke, fanned across her lips. His mouth brushed hers. It was a whisper, a shadow of a touch, a question. Iris's hand on his chest clenched, her fingers gripping a fistful of his shirt, pulling him, anchoring him. It was all the answer he needed. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the fire. It was the slow, steady, inevitable kiss of the rain. It was a kiss of discovery, deep and sure and with all the patience of the land itself. It was a kiss that tasted of smoke and mint and the iron-willed man who had given her a blanket in the cold. It was a promise, a shelter, and a claim, all in one. And Iris, who had been a solitary traveler for so long, met him. She kissed him back. A matching pressure, a quiet, fierce acknowledgement. You are here. I am here. We are here. She was shivering again, but from a different cold. Her hands, still tangled in the wool blanket at her shoulders, pulled. She was not just pulling the blanket tighter, she was pulling him closer. Colt responded. His arm, the one that wasn't burned, slid around her waist, locking her to him. He pulled her flush against his body, lifting her slightly, and took a half-step back, until her back was pressed against the warm, solid wooden wall of the tack room. She felt the cool, brass studs of a dozen hanging bridles press into her back through the wet fabric of her dress. But she didn't care. Her feet, in their ruined, ash-covered boots, shifted on the dry straw that littered the floor. He broke the kiss, but only to move his mouth to her temple, his lips brushing her hair, his breath warm against her skin. From now on, he whispered, his voice a low, rough growl against her ear. Not one more night. You will not have to sleep alone a single night. Iris tilted her head back, her eyes finding his in the golden light. Her hand moved from his chest, up to his jaw, cupping his face, her fingers feeling the rough stubble, the heat of his skin, the solid reality of him. And you, she whispered back, her voice shaking, but not from cold. You are no longer the lonely one. He kissed her again, deeper this time, a sealing of the promise. They stood there, lost to the world, the rain on the roof a wild symphony, the smell of leather and mint their own private world. Time stopped. There was only the warmth and the solid feel of him and the rightness of it. Finally, slowly, they pulled back, just enough to see each other. He was still holding her. She was still holding him. A small, shaky, involuntary smile touched Iris's lips. It was the first true smile she had given in a year. He saw it, and the corner of his own mouth, a place that had been set in a grim, hard line for a decade, lifted in an answering, unfamiliar smile. It was a moment of perfect, controlled clarity. It was not a surrender. It was an alliance. Forged in fire and sealed by water. The rain hammered on the roof, a silver curtain closing them off from the ashes of the past. And in the warm, golden light of the tack room, the two of them stood, wrapped in the dark wool blanket, the first true witness to their vow. Dawn broke over a landscape of ruin. The Arroyo Azul ranch was a wound, a sprawling scar of black mud and gray. Skeletal ash. The smell of wet soot and burned pine hung in the air, a bitter perfume. But the rain, having done its work of salvation and destruction, had moved on, leaving behind a sky so clear and blue it felt like a personal insult. They met on the porch, which was now the only clean, dry place in the compound. They did not sit. They stood, a small, weary council of war, drinking coffee that was strong, black, and cold. Colt's right hand was wrapped in a clean, white bandage. Severo had applied a poultice of comfrey and sage that stung, but it would prevent the worst of the scarring. Iris, however, was not idle. She sat on the top step, the wool blanket spread across her lap. The edge, where she had used it to beat back the embers from the calf pen, was scorched and stiff, a ragged, blackened line. In her hand was a needle, and threaded through it was not a practical, invisible brown, but a spool of bright, scarlet-red silk she had kept in her mending kit. She pushed the needle through the tough, heavy wool. Her stitches were small, precise and strong. She was not just mending the tear, she was sealing it, binding the burned edge with a line of defiant color. It was a scar she was tracing, a testament. Each stitch was a small, quiet oath. "Today," Colt said, his voice low, his eyes on that red thread, "we do not defend, we attack." He unrolled Wick's field map, the one showing the true and the false lines, and laid it on the porch rail, weighing the corners with shotgun shells. "We fight them in 3 places. We fight them on paper. We fight them with the land itself. And we fight them with the truth." The plan was laid. It was not a charge. It was a careful, intricate flanking maneuver, a game of chess played with stakes of land and water. "Iris," he said, turning to her. "The paper, the proof." "My mother's maps," she said, her needle pausing. "And Wick's notes. They're no good to us here. They're no good in a courtroom we can't get into. They need to be in the hands of the people, the ranchers, the townsfolk, the ones being cheated." He looked toward the town. "The Broome Gazette. Can they be copied?" "Lithographed," Iris said, her eyes lighting up. "Yes, it's a simple process. If Mr. Broome is willing, I can have 100 copies made before noon. An extra edition, distributed at the auction." "Good. That's your first move." Colt said, "Get the proof to Broome. Make him our printing press." He then turned to Severo, who was quietly whittling a piece of wood. "Severo, you heard them. You heard Motley and Dunn and all their liars. What's the word they use for our spring?" "Seasonal seep," Severo said, not looking up, his knife moving in a smooth, rhythmic motion. "They say it will be dry by August. Then you will show them a river." Colt said, "Take the small wagon, the buckboard, rig the 50-gallon water barrel, fill it, not with well water. Fill it from the Azul itself, from the head spring." Severo's knife stopped. He looked up, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across his face. He understood. "Take the float," Colt continued. The float was a thick piece of cottonwood Severo had carved years ago, marked with notches that they used to measure the water level in the troughs. "Set it in the barrel. Let the whole town see the flow. Let them see the water that is drying up. That is your move. Vaquero." Severo nodded, the grin gone, replaced by a look of profound satisfaction. "I will bring the mountain. They can drink from it." "And you?" Iris asked Colt, looking at his bandaged hand. "You and Wick. Wick is the truth," Colt said, his voice flat. "He's the living, breathing proof, but he's a coward. My job is to be his spine. I'll get him into town, unseen. I'll keep him in the shadows until the bell rings." "There's more," Iris said, her mind racing, seeing the other pieces on the board. "The Decency Committee, Laura Kincaid. She isn't just a zealot. She's the one who paid for the false survey. Wick said it, from the Decency Fund. It's her private army." Colt agreed. "No," Iris said. "It's her private bank account. And a bank account leaves a trail. The committee, they buy their medicines, their poultices, their moral pamphlets from one place, the town apothecary, Mrs. Finch." Colt frowned. "She's a quiet one." "She is," Iris said, a hard edge to her voice. "She's quiet because Laura Kincaid shamed her. I was there, in the shop, when Kincaid told the entire committee that Mrs. Finch's headache powders were unchristian. She humiliated her. A woman shamed like that doesn't forget. And she also," Iris added, "sees every receipt. She knows where the decency money is really going." She looked at Colt, her plan laid bare. "While I'm at the Gazette, I'm making another stop. I'm going to ask Mrs. Finch if she's ready to see those accounts made public." Colt was silent for a long moment. He was a man of direct action, of ropes and iron. This was a spider's web, and it was beautiful. "A war on 3 fronts," he said, with a nod of deep respect. "The paper, the water, and the women, they won't know which way to look." He looked at the sun, just beginning to clear the burned-out rafters of the hay barn. It's time. Severo was already hitching a mule to the buckboard. Colt went to the small cabin where Wick had spent a terrified, sleepless night. He emerged with the surveyor, who was shaking so hard he could barely walk. His face was the color of old parchment. "I can't," Wick whimpered, seeing the scorched earth, the smoldering ruins. They did this. They'll kill me. Mr. Ashburn, they'll kill me dead." "They will," Colt said, his voice devoid of pity. "If they see you first, if you stay here, or if you run, your only chance is to walk straight into the center of them and speak." I'm cold," Wick stammered, though the morning was already growing warm. Iris had finished her mending. The last red stitch was knotted, the thread cut. The blanket's edge was no longer a wound. It was a statement. She stood up from the step and walked over to the shivering surveyor. She held the blanket out. It was still hers, still warm from the sun, smelling faintly of wool and smoke. Wick looked at it, confused. "It's warm," Iris said, her voice softer now. She remembered the cold of the livery, the cold of the rain. "I've found it's hard to be brave when you're cold, and you can only tell the truth when you're warm." She draped the blanket over his thin, trembling shoulders. The weight of it seemed to steady him. He gripped the edges, his knuckles white. A small, terrified man in a large, brave blanket. "Now," Iris said, turning to Colt. "We go." They divided. Severo, whistling a low, tuneless Sonoran song, rumbled off in the buckboard, the empty barrel clanging. Heading for the springhead, Colt put Wick on the back of his own horse, mounting in front, and cut north, taking the high, rocky path, a goat trail that would lead them into town unseen. From the bluffs above, Iris took the mule and the main, muddy track. In her saddlebag was the oilcloth packet, her mother's legacy, and the key to the entire fight. The risk was enormous. They all knew it. "Iris," Colt had said, just before he rode out. He stopped her, his bandaged hand on the mule's bridle. "Motley, he'll have men. He'll have that warrant, the one for destroying property." "I remember," she said. "If it goes wrong, if they move to take you," he said, his voice low. "Do not be taken. The alley, behind the blacksmith's shop. O'Leary's side gate. It's never locked. You get there, you get through it, and you run. You ride north and you don't look back." "What about you?" she asked. "I'll be busy," he said, a grim, flat statement. "The alley. Iris, promise me." "I promise," she said. He nodded, satisfied. And he was gone. Now, she rode alone. The ruins of the ranch behind her, the hostile town before her. The plan was set. The rendezvous was firm. 12 o'clock. When the church bell struck its first note for noon, the auction would begin, and so would their war. She knew her targets. Broome, Finch, the town square. And she knew the signal. Colt had been clear. "When the bell rings," he had said, "I'm not waiting. I'm going to walk to that first false marker, the one we found together. I'm going to pull it out of the ground with my own 2 hands. And I'm going to carry it into that square. I'm going to plant it on that auction block like a spike through a liar's heart." She rode on, the red dust of the road clinging to her boots, her mind clear and cold as the water in the Azul. She was no longer a victim. She was a strategist. And she was, at last, her mother's daughter. The square in Thistle Bend was a tinderbox of humanity, packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the spark. Ranchers whose futures depended on the water, speculators smelling a quick profit, and the hard, grim-faced crews of the Rio Verdin Railroad, there to ensure their company's victory. They were all there, their boots shuffling in the ankle-deep dust, their faces turned to the newly built wooden auction platform. On that platform, Lura Kincaid stood, resplendent. She was the very picture of civilized progress, her dress the latest cut from the East, her voice a clarion call. "Today," she boomed, her voice carrying over the nervous coughing of the crowd. "Today, Thistle Bend casts off the dust of the frontier and embraces its civilized future. We welcome progress. We welcome the Rio Verdad Company, which will bring us prosperity, order, and a moral foundation for the generations to come. Beside her, Sheriff Jeb Motley, his star polished and his gut thrust forward, preened like a man who had already won. On her other side, Mr. Dunn, the railroad lawyer, stood with a thin, confident smile, a sheaf of papers in his hand. The church bell began to toll, a slow, heavy bong, marking the noon hour. On the fifth toll, a new sound entered the square. It was not a bell. It was a heavy, percussive scrape. Thud, scrape, thud. The crowd at the western edge of the square turned, then parted, a wave of confusion rippling through them. Colt Ashburn appeared. He was not on his horse. He was walking, and he was dragging the false survey marker, the 5-foot stake of raw wood. Its end still caked with the red earth of the arroyo was a heavy burden, but he moved as if it were a twig. He ignored the crowd. His eyes, burning with a cold, controlled fire, were locked on the platform. He did not stop at the steps. He mounted them in 2 long, powerful strides, his muddy boots staining the new pine. "Here now, Ashburn," Motley sputtered, his hand moving to his pistol. Colt ignored him. He walked to the precise center of the platform, right between Laura Kincaid and the lawyer. He lifted the heavy stake high over his head, his muscles coiling. With a guttural roar that came from the depths of his chest, he slammed the marker down. The sound was a wooden explosion, a thwack that shuddered through the planks, silencing the church bell, silencing the crowd. The false stake bit deep, stood vibrating, a monument to the lie, planted in the very heart of their celebration. Into the ringing, absolute silence. Iris Delaney's voice rose, sharp and clear. "This is what they are selling." She stepped from the side of the Gazette office, where she had been waiting. Mr. Broom and his young apprentice were at her side, their arms laden with fresh, damp-inked papers. They moved quickly, handing the lithographed copies of her mother's map into the eager, outstretched hands of the crowd. "Look at those papers," Iris commanded, her voice gaining strength. "That is the official, legal, and filed survey of this district from the Santa Fe Land Office, 1866. That is the law." She pointed a finger, not at the platform, but at the stake Colt had planted. "And that is the marker the Rio Verdad Company set last week. Look at the map. Their marker is not on their land. It is on our land. They are trying to auction you the water that belongs to the Arroyo Azul." A low, angry rumble began to build in the crowd. Men were looking at the maps, their faces darkening as they traced the lines, comparing it to the valley they all knew. Mr. Dunn, the lawyer, stepped forward, his smile never wavering. He began to clap, a slow, mocking punctuation. "Bravo, Miss Delaney. A truly desperate and entertaining performance. Such passion, such fiction." He turned to the crowd. "This map is a relic, a curiosity. The new official survey, sanctioned by the territory, supersedes it. What is not fiction, however," he said, his voice turning to steel, "is this—" He pulled a fresh document from his breast pocket. "This is a federal warrant for the arrest of one Iris Delaney, for the willful destruction and sabotage of Rio Verdad Railroad property. To wit, the survey markers she has just confessed to tampering with. Sheriff, do your duty." Sheriff Motley's grin was a slash of triumph. This, he understood. This was power. "Iris Delaney," he bellowed, his voice thick with malice, "you are under arrest." He stepped off the platform, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol, his eyes locked on her. He took one step. "Sheriff," the call came from the side. Severo Molina, his face like carved wood, stood on the back of his small buckboard wagon. On it sat the 50-gallon water barrel, plugged with a wooden bung. "The railroad tells us the Azul is a seasonal seep," Severo called out, his voice sharp as a hawk's cry. "They tell us it will be dry by August." Motley froze, annoyed at the interruption. "Get out of the way, old man. This is official business." "A seasonal seep," Severo repeated, a dry, humorless laugh in his throat. Then I suppose this, he kicked the bung from the barrel, is just a seasonal splash. A 50-gallon torrent of dark, crystal-clear water gushed from the barrel, hitting the dusty square with a sound like a small explosion. It soaked Motley's boots and splashed the dresses of the women in the front row. It was not a trickle. It was a flood. The wooden float, carved with measurement notches, clattered out and landed in the new, spreading puddle. A rancher, one of Colt's neighbors, bent and picked it up. He stared at it, his eyes wide. "My God," he whispered, then held it high for all to see. This is the high water mark, the notch. It says the spring is running higher than last season." The lie was exposed, lying dark and wet in the dust. "It's the truth, he's telling the truth. It's all a lie." The new voice was a high-pitched, terrified shriek. On top of the now empty barrel, a figure stood up, wrapped in the dark wool blanket. It was Josiah Wick. "My name is Josiah Wick," he screamed, his body shaking so hard the blanket vibrated. "I'm a surveyor. I was on the crew. They made me change the numbers." "Lies," Dunn roared, his face finally losing its composure, turning a dull, angry red. "No," Wick cried, pulling his own field book from his pocket. Here are my real notes. They paid the foreman in gold to steal this valley, said I'd end up like Eliza Delaney if I didn't." "Who paid you, Mr. Wick?" a woman's voice called from the crowd. It was Mrs. Finch, the apothecary, standing on a crate, her face alive with a righteous fury. "Who paid the gold?" Wick's shaking hand rose. He pointed, past the sheriff, past the lawyer, his finger landing on the source of all the town's moral authority. She did Laura Kincaid. She paid him from the decency fund. She called it God's work. The square exploded. The roar was no longer a murmur. It was a physical thing. "Thief. Liar." "That's our money done." Seeing the entire, carefully constructed plan dissolving into anarchy, panicked. "Guards!" he screamed at the half-dozen armed railroad men he had planted in the crowd. "Do your job. Secure the platform. Arrest those men." The railroad guns, hard cases in long dusters, drew their weapons. They began to shove the crowd back, their rifles leveling. The leader, a man with a scarred face, raised his Colt Navy pistol and aimed it squarely at the man by the marker. "Ashburn," he sneered. "You're done." Colt had not moved. He stood, a rock in the churning stream. His bandaged right hand was still at his side. His left hand, his good hand, was at his belt, holding the coiled leather of his riata. He was not wearing a gun. "Last chance," the gunman said, stepping onto the platform. Colt's left hand moved. It was not a throw. It was a strike, a flick of the wrist, so fast it was invisible. The heavy, weighted end of the riata shot out like a rattlesnake, a blur of leather. It wrapped around the gunman's wrist with a sickening crack. Colt yanked, a single, savage, downward pull. The gunman screamed, a high, thin sound, as his arm was wrenched down. The Colt Navy flew from his numb fingers and clattered to the wood. It had taken less than a second. Sheriff Motley, seeing his authority, his power, his entire world disappearing, made his last, desperate move. He pulled his own pistol, but he did not aim at Colt. He aimed at the source. He aimed at Iris. "Colt!" Iris screamed. A warning, not a plea. Colt was already turning. He didn't have time to recoil. He grabbed the loop of the riata and threw it, a short, fast, underhand toss. Even as Motley was pulling back the hammer, the loop sailed, small and tight. It sailed over the sheriff's head. It missed, but it was not aimed at his head. Colt snapped his wrist up, and the loop, weighted by its own speed, tightened on the one thing Motley held: the pistol. The gun fired, the bullet exploding harmlessly into the planks as the riata snatched the weapon from Motley's hand. The pistol flew in a high, spinning arc. Severo Molina, who had been watching from his wagon, stepped forward and, as casually as if he were kicking a rock from his path, stuck out his boot. He met the spinning pistol in midair. It flew, deflected, and and landed with a perfect, final plunk, disappearing into the dark. Muddy water of the 50-gallon barrel, the church bell, which had been ringing unheard, fell silent. The entire square was frozen. Then the crowd found its voice. Justice! Seize them! Get the judge to the district court! The district court! A new voice boomed, deep and laced with authority. Is precisely where this matter will be settled. The crowd parted. A tall, grim-faced man in a rumpled black suit, flanked by 2 armed federal marshals, strode onto the platform. It was Judge Elias Thorne, the district judge from Santa Fe. He ignored the railroad men, ignored the sheriff. He nodded to Mr. Broom. Your telegram last night, Mr. Broom, was compelling. I decided to attend this public auction myself. The judge's gaze swept over the scene. The false marker, the puddled water, the cowering surveyor, the disarmed lawman. Marshals, he said, his voice cold as iron. Take Mr. Wick's notes. Take Miss Delaney's maps. Take the ledger from the Decency Fund, which Mrs. Finch was so kind to provide me. They are to be sealed as evidence. He turned, his gaze finally landing on Laura Kincaid. Madam, you are a disgrace to your office and your town. Laura Kincaid had shrunk. She was no longer a pillar of righteousness. She was just a pale, shaking woman, her hands clasped, her face a mask of terror. Iris watched her. She saw a woman suddenly exposed to a wind far colder than any in the desert. She was cold. Iris walked to the wagon. She took the heavy wool blanket from Josiah Wick's shoulders. He nodded, his face stained with tears, but his eyes, for the first time, were steady. Iris walked back onto the platform. She walked past Colt, her shoulder brushing his, a silent, electric charge. She walked past the marshals and the judge. She stopped directly in front of Laura Kincaid. The woman flinched, expecting a blow. Iris did not strike her. She unfolded the blanket of the livery, the blanket of the fire, the blanket of the testimony. She draped it over Laura Kincaid's shaking shoulders. Laura looked up, her face a mask of confusion. Keep it, Iris said, her voice quiet, but it carried over the entire, silent square. It will keep you warm, and perhaps it will remind you what it feels like to be concealed. The trial, when it happened, was less a battle and more a foregone conclusion. Judge Elias Thorne, having seen the truth laid bare in the town square, was not in a mood for legal maneuvering. The proceedings in Santa Fe were swift, brutal, and decisive. Wick's field notes, when compared against her mother's immaculate maps, were a perfect match. The red pencil line of truth, drawn by a terrified surveyor, aligned exactly with the black ink line of truth, drawn by a murdered clerk, Mrs. Finch's ledger. When opened, showed a systematic drain from the Decency Fund, with large, unexplained cash withdrawals that correlated perfectly with the dates of the fraudulent survey. The judgment was an iron door slamming shut. The district court ruled the new survey markers null and void, an act of corporate malfeasance and deliberate fraud. The original boundary lines, as recorded by Eliza Delaney, were affirmed as the one and only legal boundary. The Arroyo Azul, its springhead, and all its riparian lands belonged to the ranches, as they always had. Laura Kincaid, stripped of her public authority, was indicted on 2 counts of embezzlement and 1 of conspiracy to commit fraud. Her husband, the mayor, resigned in disgrace the next day. Sheriff Jeb Motley, found by the court to have used his office not to uphold the law, but to enforce a criminal enterprise, was summarily stripped of his badge. He was last seen riding west, his face a mask of sour defeat. Mr. Dunn and the Rio Verdad Company, in a desperate bid to avoid federal mail fraud charges, cooperated. The company was forced to abandon its planned route. The original maps, the ones they had tried to bury, were now their prison. The new route, to respect Eliza Delaney's line, would require them to span the widest, deepest part of the arroyo. It would mean a bridge, an expensive, time-consuming, and humiliating testament to their failure. It would cost them, as Mr. Broom gleefully calculated in his next edition. Upwards of $50,000. An astronomical sum. But for Iris, the true victory was not financial. It was written in a quiet, leather-bound county ledger, at her request. Judge Thorne had reviewed the case of the Santa Fe Land Office fire. He ruled the original investigation incomplete and prejudiced. He formally struck the finding of accidental death and the associated unspoken suspicion of arson. Eliza Delaney's name was entered into the official record, not as a victim, not as a troublemaker, but as Eliza Delaney, clerk, whose meticulous preservation of the public trust and whose fidelity to the legal boundaries of this territory, at the cost of her own life, have ensured the rightful and just dispensation of property for its citizens. Her name was clean. Her legacy was no longer a secret, wrapped in oilcloth. It was the law. When Iris returned to Thistlebend, she was not the vagrant who had been refused a room. She was a landowner, a vindicator, a quiet hero. The Broom Gazette published a special edition, the lead editorial, which was reprinted in papers as far away as Denver, was not about the legal battle. It was titled, "The Blanket and the Boundary." Mr. Broom wrote of two kinds of lines. The lines men draw on maps to claim ownership, and the lines they draw in their own hearts. He wrote of a town so obsessed with the rigid, moral lines of a decency committee that it had failed to see the crooked, criminal lines of a survey. "We were a town," he wrote, "that would deny a cold woman a room for the night for fear of a scandal, and in our zeal, we nearly handed our entire future to the men who were truly scandalous. We were saved, not by our rules, but by the kindness of a single, solitary man, by a blanket, tossed into a dark stall. Let this be our lesson. True decency is not found in a poster. It is found in an act of warmth. A boundary is not just a line in the dust. It is a shared respect. Thistlebend has been given a second chance. We have been reminded of our true boundary. It is the one that separates kindness from cruelty, and truth from greed." The town, humbled, began to heal. The court had ordered the Rio Verdad Company to pay restitution for the destruction of Colt's property. The check arrived, certified and delivered with a sour face by a railroad clerk. It was for a substantial sum. Colt Ashburn, a man who built things to last, did not pocket the money. He did not build a grander house. He walked to the ruins of his hay barn. He, Severo, and his hands, now including a grateful Josiah Wick, who had been given a job as a permanent bookkeeper, set to work. They salvaged every unscorched timber. They sifted the ash for nails, and they rebuilt. They rebuilt the barn, beam by beam, exactly as it had been, only stronger, its new foundations set deeper. Iris, too, had been awarded a sum for her part in bringing the fraud to light. She did not use it to buy a new dress or a ticket back east. She walked to the small, abandoned adobe chapel at the edge of town, the one with the cracked bell and the weeds in the doorway. She bought it from the county for $1, with her own money. She mended the roof. She put new glass in the windows. She planed the old, warped doors of the livery stable, the ones O'Leary had discarded, and turned them into long, smooth tables. She hung a new slate on the wall. A week later, the Thistlebend School for All opened its doors. Her first 5 pupils were Billy, Finn, and Pace, and 2 ranchers' children who had never before had a teacher. In the new, clean-smelling blacksmith shop at the Arroyo Azul Ranch, a new forge was lit. Severo Molina, who had worked silently through the rebuilding, took the Riata Colt had used in the square. It was the one he had made for Colt, 20 years prior. Its weighted end was scuffed from the strike, its loop stretched from the disarming. He did not mend it. He did not recoil it. He walked to the main wall of the shop and hung it, looped in a perfect circle, over the highest peg. "It will stay," he'd said, the only time he spoke of it. "To remind us." "Remind us of what?" Billy had asked, his nose smudged with soot. Severo looked at the rope. "To remind us that a line can be used for more than one thing. It can be used to hold, it can be used to pull, and, sometimes, it must be used to strike." It is a tool. Hee-ho. You must choose what it is for. The greatest change, however, happened on the land itself. The day after the verdict was read, the ranchers of the valley, Colt's neighbors, rode out. They did not ride to his ranch. They rode to the false boundary. With their own hands, they pulled the false markers from the earth. They loaded them onto a wagon, drove them to the railroad camp, and dumped them, without a word, at the feet of the new foreman. Then they returned. They brought wagons loaded with new posts. They brought spools of wire, and following the lines on Iris Delaney's lithographed map, the map of her mother, they began to build a new fence, a right and true fence, on Sunday, a week after the trial. The work was done. The entire valley was lined, secure and whole, to celebrate. The families did not go to church. They brought their picnics, baskets of bread, smoked hams, and apple pies not to the town square, but to the banks of the Arroyo Azul. They spread their blankets under the shade of the cottonwoods, the same trees that had been stolen and were now returned. They let their children splash in the cold, clear water, their laughter echoing off the red rocks. Colt and Iris were there, sitting slightly apart from the main group. He had brought beef. She had brought a book, but they did not eat. And she did not read. They just watched. That evening, Iris walked alone, up to the rise above the ranch house, to the base of the largest, oldest cottonwood, the one she had designated as the mother tree. The air was sweet with sage, and the valley below was filled with the sound of the cattle bells, a peaceful evening music. She sat, her back against the rough, ancient bark. She pulled a piece of paper and a pencil from her pocket. She did not address it. She did not need to. "I finished it," she wrote, her pencil moving swiftly, surely, over the page. "The line you drew, it was not just a line on a map. It was a line of truth. It was hard to follow. It was buried, and they tried to move it. But I found it. It is safe now. The whole valley is safe. Today, they built the fences along your mark. I have straightened the line, Mama. The one they couldn't break in you, and the one they couldn't move in the end." She looked at the words, her throat tight. Then she folded the paper. Twice, she found a small, dark crevice in the bark of the great tree, a hollow in its heart, and she tucked the letter deep inside. A final, secret message, given to the wind and the leaves. She was, at last, at peace. The sunset over the Arroyo Azul was not a quiet ending. It was a conflagration. The sky burned with colors so deep they felt new, as if the land, having been scoured by fire and water, was painting itself into a new existence. The air, washed clean, was filled with the only thing that mattered, the scent of sage and the cottonwood fluff, which drifted on the evening breeze like a warm summer snow, catching in the new leaves, a promise of renewal. Colt stood by the newly rebuilt stable. The structure was a testament to his will. The new, pale pine beams set against the salvaged, scorched dark timbers of the old. He held the wool blanket in his hands. It was the same one, the one from the livery, the one that had shielded the calves, the one that had witnessed their first kiss in the tack room. He saw the scorch marks at the edge, the testament of the fire, and running along that dark, wounded line, he saw the bright scarlet-red thread of Iris's stitches. She had not hidden the scar. She had illuminated it. She had made it beautiful. He folded it, not with the sharp, military precision of a soldier, but with the care of a man handling something sacred. He walked to the main door of the stable, to the heavy iron hook that O'Leary had once used for bridles. This was the door where she had spent her first night. This was where the story had begun. He lifted the blanket and hung the mended, scarred, beautiful thing on the hook, where the setting sun caught the red thread, making it glow like a line of fire. He turned, wiping his hands on his trousers, a habit of a man finished with a chore, and he saw her. Iris was standing on the porch of the main house. She was not the soot-stained refugee from the fire, nor the dusty vagrant from the stagecoach. She was dressed in a simple, clean white skirt and a blue blouse. Her hair was tied back. and in her arms, she held her mother's maps, but they were not loose papers in a broken case. She had, with the same red thread, bound them. The thin wooden case, its purpose served, was gone. She held her legacy, not as a burden, but as a book. He walked toward her. He crossed the yard, his boots silent in the soft earth. He stopped at the bottom step, looking up at her. He did not have a ring. He did not have a speech. He did not get on one knee. That was for other men, in other places. He was a man of the arroyo, a man of fences and foundations, and she was a woman of lines, of maps, and of the truth. Their entire courtship had been a trial, a survey, a rebuilding. All the necessary words had already been spoken, in smoke and in ink, and in the dark. He looked at her, at the bound book she held, at the clean, strong line of her jaw. His voice was low, the same gravelly rasp she had heard in the dark of the livery, but the hardness was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet resonance. "We live," he said, "as two people with nothing left to hide. Is that all right?" Iris's face, which had been composed, broke. A smile, slow and brilliant as the sunrise, spread across her features. She did not wait for him to come to her. She walked down the 2 steps until she was standing on the same earth as he. She reached out and placed her hand, the one that had held a surveyor's pen, flat against his chest, just as she had in the tack room. She felt the steady, unwavering beat of his heart. "I was never hiding anything from you, Colt," she whispered, her voice thick, not even the fear. He moved, his bandaged hand coming up to cup her jaw, his good arm sliding around her waist, pulling her in. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, exploratory kiss of the tack room. It was a kiss of arrival. It was deep, slow, and certain. It was the kiss of a man who had found his boundary, and the kiss of a woman who had found her home. It was a promise, sealed in the high, clean air. The sage-scented wind, the only witness, gusted around them, rattling the new leaves of the cottonwoods. It sounded, just for a second, like the valley itself was applauding. "Well, it's about time." The voice, dry and amused, broke them apart. Severo Molina stood on the porch, his arms crossed, a smile so rare and wide it looked like it pained his face. Beside him, holding a large wooden box camera, was Mr. Broom from the Gazette. "Stay," Broom commanded, a black cloth appearing in his hand. Just like that. Don't you dare move." He ducked under the cloth. Colt kept his arm around Iris's waist. She kept her hand on his chest. Severo stood, beaming, in the background, a flash of powder, a cloud of white smoke, and the moment was captured. "The schoolteacher and the solitary of Arroyo Azul," Broom announced from beneath the cloth. "That, gentlemen, will sell papers." Their new life began, not with a honeymoon, but with work. It was the only way they knew. Iris's school in the old chapel flourished, but on days when the weather was too beautiful, she brought her pupils to the ranch. Colt, with his own hands, had taken the strong, unburned timbers from the hay barn. He'd set them as posts under the great, ancient cottonwood. For a roof, he'd used the salvaged tin from the stables, the pockmarks from the rain and embers still visible, and for tables. Iris had brought the old, scarred doors from the Thistle Bend livery, the very doors that had once barred her from safety. Now, the children, Billy and Finn and Pace, their letters becoming words, sat at them, their slates clicking, their voices bright in the open air. They had, quite literally, turned their wounds into a shelter. The dark wool blanket, with its scarlet, mended edge, now hung permanently by the door of the main house. It was not a trophy. It was an invitation. It was a promise to the wind that in this valley, no one, ever again, would be left cold. Any traveler, lost or weary, would see it and know it was a place of refuge. That evening, as the first stars pricked the deep indigo sky, a new sound cut through the peace. It was the high, lonely wail of a train whistle. Iris, who was helping Colt stack the last of the new-cut pine, froze. It was the sound of her arrival, the sound of her fear. But the whistle was different now. It was farther away. It was to the east, following the new, expensive, bridge-bound route. It was a sound of defeat, a sound of a boundary, respected. Colt did not look at the horizon. He was watching her. He saw her tense, and he saw her relax. He came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He put his chin on her shoulder, and they looked out at the valley. Their valley, together. "It's just a sound," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Just a sound," she agreed, leaning back into him. They both knew the only line that mattered, the only boundary that could not be broken, was the one they had just formed, the boundary of their word. To love deeply, to live squarely, and to protect the clear, blue water for all the ones who would come after. The fall roundup was coming. The railroad, however reluctantly, would bring a new kind of prosperity. The town of Thistle Bend, quieter and more humble, was healing. And at the Arroyo Azul, a family was about to be formed. They stood, watching the stars, a solid, two-person fortress against the desert. On the hook by the door, the blanket hung, a silent guardian, and beside it, on that same hook, there was a small, empty space. A space, perhaps, just big enough for a small coat, on a future day. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to connect with you, so please, leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from, and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. And if you enjoyed this tale, please support us by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more folks.